Hey, what's up, everyone? My name is Jeff, and this is how I read 2 books a week despite having dyslexia. Now, first off, this is completely anecdotal. This is just my story. This isn't something that will fix your kid, but I do think that there are a lot of things that were done with me in my childhood, as well as things that I have found throughout just like loving to read and reading lots of books throughout my life, that I found things that work with at least my style of dyslexia. And so hopefully this is helpful for those that have kids with dyslexia, those that have dyslexia. Many people find out that they have dyslexia later on in life, like I did. And this is something that I find works for helping me find more enjoyment with reading in general. Now, as far as 2 books a week, that's not something everyone can do, of course. This is September 18th when I'm recording this. That's about 37 weeks in the year. I think this is the beginning of the 38th week. And I have read 80 books so far. So I'm actually a little bit over 2 books a week. That being said, 53 of those have been completely finished, and 37 of them are ones that I fired after reading 100 pages or so. Not everyone can do this. Not everyone has the time to be able to read that many books in a year. And nor does anyone have access to books that way. I'll tell some of the ways that I go about doing that, but I'll be honest, a lot of it involves just having ADHD, having insomnia, and dyslexia actually does make me a much slower reader, much slower than her. I read about half the pace that she does, but I'm still able to read, I think, more books than she does as well when we have the time. Part of that, again, is the not sleeping, is helpful. All right, let's go ahead and dive into what I think are the main things that benefit being able to read with dyslexia. Number 1, first off, I actually love reading. I think that's an important thing. And this is where I'll say I credit, my childhood and upbringing, and I want to make sure that, I think that there are ways to teach kids with dyslexia how to love reading. And the number one thing that I think helped me was that when I was asked to go read for chores, or in 3rd grade, there was this big contest of people who could read the most. They judged everything based off of the minutes that you put into reading rather than the pages. I was not as good at reading the pages, but I was much better at reading for a long period of time, just because, we had fun. And I grew up on a ranch. We had tons of things to do outside. I did lots of things outside. I was actively playing on trampoline or whatever, but during colder months, or just after you've played for an hour or 2 outside, sometimes it's nice to curl up with a book and read. And the people around me were reading, which I have actually quite a few siblings with dyslexia. So this is something that has worked with not just me, but others as well. I think that having a focus around the amount of time you spend reading is so much more important for child development than simply just doing it based off the pages or the number of books you finished. The amount of time you spend reading, I think, is beneficial. It's all about how much time people are spending in their imagination. And that's what books really are for, in my mind, is helping activate the brain and the imagination so that kids can fall in love with that feeling. And not only that, but I feel like once you have learned that feeling with fictional books, that actually ends up adding to your ability to read nonfiction as well. I did a challenge in college years where I did like 7 books in 7 days of nonfiction stuff. I've read maybe 250 nonfiction self-help type of books in my past. I've read plenty of nonfiction as well, but I definitely think that finding enjoyment in fiction books is a great way to help with growing that imagination and helping love reading for those with dyslexia. All right, and everything else, I'm just going to be talking about just simply what works for me and what I have found works, and hopefully it does work for you. Leave it down in the comments below if these things are things that you have tried. If you have dyslexia, I would love to hear all about that. Number 2, physical books don't really work for me. I do not like reading a physical paper book. For example, this is a book that a fan sent me. It's a really, really big book, big pages and lots of really tiny text. This is the kind of book I was reading when I was a kid, was these bigger books. We just had a lot of that style. I read a lot of Harry Potter growing up, and I read lots of physical books. I read about like twice as slow on physical books as I do with as something on my phone. This book I found on Kindle Unlimited. I do use a lot of Kindle Unlimited. There's a lot of other cheap books on Kindle as well. There's also the Libby app and many other ways that you can read besides just Kindle, but that's what I generally use. That or Royal Road, which is a web novel website where I find almost everything for free, or everything is free on Royal Road, but that's along the style I like. Anyway, getting into lots of different details there, but I prefer reading with really big letters on a phone. And this starts from when I was working as a lighting tech for an auditorium. So we would run shows. We would run a lot of musicals and plays. And in my college years, that's what I was doing. As my side job was I was running the lighting, I was running the sound, and I was kind of the extra guy through all of that. As the college kid, and I was just stuck in the dark for 4 to 6 hours at a time because of running shows, keeping the lights off, and running sound and audio. And there was a lot of just sit and wait for your cue, sit and wait for what you need to do. And I had an iPod back then. I had a phone, a normal phone, and then I had an iPod that I was able to put the Kindle app onto. And this was 2008, 2009, 2010. That I just started adding to my Kindle audiobook, like my library there. And I was actually able to read in the dark with the iPod. And that worked better for me than anything else ever had. And I kind of became addicted again to reading, despite loving reading with Harry Potter and other books in the past. Something finally clicked for me when I wasn't reading physical books. And I'm not sure if this is something that's true for all dyslexia people, but I have talked to several and they've seen something similar where they prefer reading with something that is on a phone over something physical. And part of the reason for that is what I'm going to get into for the third point. The third point is I like to make my words big. And I'm not sure how well you can see that, but this is how big I have the words. And this is actually smaller than sometimes I do have it. I like to have, you notice a lot of these things don't naturally fit into the page. The pages end up being not very many words. And that is one of the most important things. This is from this book, by the way. I'm still reading it right now. I like to have the words big enough that there aren't too many lines on a page, because one of the biggest issues for me is that sometimes I'm reading far enough ahead, and this is, I think, something that happens with dyslexia. It might just be my own personal version of it, but as you're reading through, you end up jumping to the next line before you've fully comprehended the line before it. And if I have the words big enough, if I have not too many lines on that page or what I'm reading there, then it drastically improves my ability to comprehend and not get caught up as I'm reading, which is the main cause for me of my dyslexia frustration when it comes to reading. So if I'm reading this paragraph up here and I start like seeing stuff down here, I'm not sure if this is an ADHD thing or dyslexia, but I tend to get caught up reading lots of things at once. And I've heard that from dyslexia people as well as ADHD people, that's something they end up doing is they're almost reading 3 or 4 things all at the same time. My screens just all went down. Okay, we're back up and running. And that is something that I found works for me, is as long as I have the words big enough, I'm able to keep focused on it more and drawn back into the moment better, and which keeps my brain and the imagination active, which I think is the most important part of reading, is that you're not drawn out of the imagination state, which is where the love of reading comes from, is a little bit of that escapism, escaping into the world and the imagination that's there, that is drawn up by the author for you to dive into. This is one of the reasons I actually prefer not having physical books, is because you can actually have the control of how big the words are on apps, on websites. There are many ways to be able to control how big the text actually is. And as you get used to that, I find for me, I have a hard time like even looking at these books now that have the much smaller text, because it causes me like a level of anxiety simply seeing how many mistakes I could end up making with that as I go through it, which is funny. I didn't have that issue before, but since I found like a better method of reading for me, I am very, very much more focused on reading that way. I've read, many books physical since I first started this, but I've moved to where now I avoid it like the plague, honestly. And so I'd love to hear if that works for you guys. If you try it out, let me know. And the fourth thing is audiobooks. I know I said it's not just audiobooks in the title here. and it's not just audiobooks, but that doesn't mean audiobooks don't work. One thing people don't know about dyslexia is dyslexia also affects your ears as well. The way the auditory comprehension of the English language or any language is affected oftentimes by dyslexia as well. And so if people are giving me a list of things, I don't listen, I don't hear it very well, or I start hearing multiple things at once or comprehending multiple things at once with my dyslexia. This could also be playing into ADHD as well, but 30% of people with dyslexia also have ADHD. So this is a big part of dyslexia for many people. So audiobooks can definitely help, but I read at least 2 books for every one audiobook I read. That being said, audiobooks can definitely help with being able to find that same excitement for escaping into another world. There are many good narrators that are out there that help bring those books to life. And again, the whole point is the enjoyment of diving into your imagination. I found that certain narrators I like to have on at faster speeds for me, and it does somehow work better where I can comprehend better as they're speaking a little bit quicker. I think that it keeps me into the book at times, but there's also narrators, even though they speak slower, I prefer them to be at the normal pace just because it's, again, all about what keeps you in your imagination, what keeps you away from being too distracted. And sometimes I do play phone games, or I'm doing dishes or keeping busy as I'm listening to audiobooks, because that's just how audiobooks work. I grew up listening to audiobooks on big road trips with my family. We, drove from Arizona to New York and back. And I remember listening to audiobooks throughout that time period. And that's one of the things that really got me to love audiobooks, is just experiencing it. So I definitely love audiobooks. That's something that can work for a lot of people with dyslexia, but that's not the point of this. Yes, that can help you find the love for books and love for reading, but the goal is to find enough love that you can actually enjoy, reading physically. Is digitally counted as physically as well? I feel like so many people have drawn lines in the sand for like, audiobooks don't count as actually reading, but you're comprehending the book in the same way as other things. This is somewhere where it's like in my 80 books, I don't count podcasts, but there's often times that if I've read enough of a podcast or listened to enough of a podcast, it qualifies to me in the same way that audiobooks do. I'd love to hear that whole discussion down in the comments below as well. That's an interesting one. And the final thing I'm going to talk about here, there's plenty of other things I can go into when it would come to like specific what I would recommend, just small things that have worked for me. But the number one thing that I feel like has helped me in the last 5 years of my reading experience is learning when to fire books. And this is one of the things I talked about. I've finished 53 books in this year, and then 37 of those have been fired. It's something where I realized that the author just did not mesh with the way that I was wanting to read and enjoy the books. It is totally okay to drop a book and not be forced to finish a book that you don't like, especially with books being so available nowadays for cheap or for free, either through Kindle Unlimited, Libby app, which has the, all of library books available there. You have to kind of check them out still and everything through that system, but there's many books available through digital means that you can have access to very quickly. If you are finding books that are physical that do have maybe a little bit bigger text, I found, like, for me, Angels and Demons was a book by Dan Brown that when I was in high school, I was able to read that a lot better because his chapters are a lot shorter. He has like way shorter chapters than the typical book. And I loved that. I loved that the text was a little bigger in the short, small book that I had of it, at least. And that went well with my brain and my imagination. But be okay with firing books if you don't like them. I like to put the gauge of it has to be after 50 pages, because then I actually gave the intro a try. This is why with my book reviews, I do a measure on hook and draw. So I like to have a book have the chance to hook me, which is typically within the first 35 to 50 pages. They give the good, a lot of times the hook is in the first, it should be in the first paragraph or two. But some give a hook kind of in the second chapter or whatever. And then also being able to have a chance to see how the draw of how much do I want to come back after I read the first 50 pages. A lot of times I'll read 50 pages, or, I'm typically like 80, 90 to 100 is when I kind of gauge this and just say, okay, like, do I like this enough to keep going forward? And if it draws me in at all, or if I'm curious about the story, that's when I come back and I try reading more. And sometimes I drop it again after another 100 pages or 50, and a lot of times I just finish it because it's good, and I don't always go back to the second book. But this is also because when you're reading lots of books, sometimes you get into not as well recommended books, or the ones that are the best. Which is why, again, part of this channel is to be focusing on giving the books I think are worth the try, are worth looking into, are the ones that I think people would be interested in, that I think do provide that mental escape, that dive into imagination. A lot of my stuff can be a little bit more adult, but I do try to recommend stuff that is just interesting as well for any age. And I try to actually gauge that as well. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you do, please leave a like and subscribe so you can see more about this. I hope this helped show how people, even with dyslexia, can still find a love for books. It's not something that is just a given that they won't read books. I know plenty of people with dyslexia that read all the time. It is not about not liking books with dyslexia. It's something completely different. It's more of just how we process language. And so I hope these things, these resources that are out there, can help you find more love for the reading that you enjoy doing. Whether you have dyslexia or not, let me know if this helps with all people, because I do think that having words bigger is just something that is better. She doesn't agree for her, and so it's completely something that is up to me, up to you. And anyway, hope you guys enjoyed it. See you in the next one. Thanks so much, and bye-bye.